I believe that we are going to get along with the Russian people very, very well.
The Iron Curtain has descended across the country.
And resolute action.
I shall go to Korea.
I am not and never have been a member of the Communist Party.
We shall pay any price, bear any burden, support any friend, oppose any foe.
Hell no, we won't go.
We believe that peace is at hand.
Will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States.
We understand each other better. That's a key to peace.
The Eagle and the Bear. Dispatches from the Cold War. Dateline, 1979, Afghanistan. Across the valleys and mountains of Afghanistan, several times a day, the sound of prayer. These devout Muslims turn to Mecca to pray. Prayers to Muhammad. Prayers of homage. Prayers for revenge. Revenge against the Soviet infidels. On December 24, 1979, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. The first Soviet invasion of a country outside the Eastern Bloc since World War II. Modern tanks and sophisticated technology were pitted against the poorly armed and politically divided tribes of Afghanistan warriors. But despite the Soviet Union's superior arms, the Soviets were up against the fierce independence and fervent religion of the Afghan people. The war was proclaimed a jihad, a holy war, where martyrdom could be achieved by dying, fighting the invader. And Afghanistan has a long history of winning such wars, of making life very unpleasant for those who try to oppress it.
They are determined to remain free. They are willing to fight forever. It's already 7 years. But they are used to fighting. They're not like other countries that suddenly mobilize themselves to resist. They are always fighting each other, if necessary, foreigners preferably.
In the 19th century, Afghanistan was caught between British-ruled India and Tsarist Russia. When the Tsar threatened to invade the country, the British marched in first. But Britain was never able to win complete control and was eventually forced to withdraw. The Afghan monarchy learned how to juggle the opposing threats of Britain and the Soviet Union. When the Russian Revolution took place, Afghanistan was the first to recognize Lenin's Republic of Soviets. In return, Lenin signed a friendship treaty with the Afghans and agreed to supply arms. By the time of his grand tour of Europe in 1928, King Amanullah Khan was still juggling the superpowers. He was also fascinated by Western democracy and wanted to bring Afghanistan into the modern age. But his failure to recognize how deeply Afghanistan was rooted in Islamic religion would be his downfall. On the tour, his queen, Saroya, bared her arms in public, and the pictures were published around the world. The Afghanistan people felt she had displayed herself naked before the world. When Amanullah arrived home, he was overthrown by a religious uprising. Such political instability and upheaval would remain a part of Afghan life. The country is mountainous and inaccessible. Some 20 different languages are spoken. The people have always resisted a centralized government.
The Afghans have never supported that. They're mostly tribal people, and they never supported or accepted central control from Kabul, let alone from anywhere else.
World War II saw the emergence of a new superpower to replace Britain, America. And after the war ended, Afghanistan turned to the United States government for help. America did give some aid for development projects, helping to build roads and canals and irrigation projects. But Afghanistan was also developing close ties with the Soviet Union. By 1957, when the King of Afghanistan visited the Soviet Union, the country was not only receiving increasing amounts of Soviet aid, but also Soviet military support.
The Afghan ruler takes the salute. Afghanistan, bordering both Russia and India, has long been watched and wooed by the rulers of the Kremlin, whether czars or commissars. Personalities and ideologies change, but geography doesn't.
The Soviets even built a tunnel through the Salang Pass. In the years to come, it would prove a critical route for their invasion forces. The U.S. rose to the competition, but again the Soviets responded. Roads, hotels, airports, all were built as Afghanistan became one of the world's primary recipients of international development money from both the West and the Soviet Union. Afghanistan's Prime Minister, Mohammed Daoud, was skilled at balancing the superpowers. He ruled Afghanistan with an iron fist and welcomed Soviet support. But when Daoud made overtures to America, he antagonized Afghanistan's growing numbers of communists. In 1974, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger arrived in Kabul to meet with President Daoud. Kissinger was taken to see the ancient game of Buzkashi. He sat in the stands with his wife Nancy. To an outsider, it must have seemed a barbaric and confusing game, where only the players' fierce independence and physical courage were apparent. The goal was to carry a dead goat around the stadium. It must have seemed as confusing as the intrigue of Afghanistan politics and society. For beneath the surface in Afghanistan, unrest was fermenting. President Daoud's time was ticking away. Afghanistan communists were plotting against him, and it would not be long before they would rise up. By the late 1970s, Afghanistan was becoming increasingly impoverished. Health and nutrition was appalling. Nearly half its babies died. The Afghanistan government had misused its foreign aid and was failing to deal with these pressing problems. It was also becoming increasingly repressive. It was here, in the streets and coffee shops of Kabul, that the Afghanistan Communist Party began drawing its members and began plotting against President Mohammed Daoud. The party was principally a city party and was never able to appeal to the rural people. But in a fragmented country like Afghanistan, it wasn't necessary to have widespread support. At most, the Afghan communists had about 5,000 members. On April 27, 1978, 600 soldiers surrounded President Daoud's palace. He and his bodyguards were gunned down as they fought to the death in true Afghan style. The new president, Nur Muhammad Taraki, denied any communist involvement. Certainly, the increasing numbers of Soviet advisors who thronged the streets and council chambers of Kabul had not played an active role in the coup, but they had also made no attempt to stop it.
In my opinion, they condoned, or more than condoned, cooperated in the takeover and a bloody coup by the Afghan communists. And then the Afghan people rose in masses within weeks. 26 out of the 28 provinces were up in arms, and that is literally true. And the local communists, who obviously could not understand why this was happening, couldn't control the situation.
Before long, people were fleeing to refugee camps in Pakistan. Their numbers grew into hundreds of thousands. They came with a myriad of stories. Religious mullahs were being rounded up and killed. landowners forced to surrender their property. Young men press-ganged into the Afghan army. And symbolic of all this change, the government had replaced Afghan's Islamic flag with an all-red flag, remarkably similar to the flags flown in the Soviet Union's Central Asian republics. One of America's allies, the Shah of Iran, was alarmed. He warned America that it was part of a Soviet grand plan. But in Washington, government officials dismissed the upheaval as a nationalist, not communist affair. That summer, 1978, Washington sent a new ambassador to Kabul, Adolph Spike Dubs.
I go dedicated to pressing our national interests. But I also hope that I can transmit to the Afghan government and the Afghan people characteristics which make our nation such a great one, as well as its people. I hope I can convey our sense of compassion, the sympathy, the understanding, and the support that American people give to the downtrodden and to the underprivileged.
Beneath Dubs' compassionate statement, he harbored deep fears that the Soviet Union was planning a full-scale military takeover of Afghanistan. Dubs had recommended contingency planning, but the State Department had dismissed his fears as ridiculous. In any case, Washington was increasingly concerned by the upheavals in Tehran, where Ayatollah Khomeini's religious revolution was beginning to take hold. In Afghanistan, the Soviets secretly gave the government $250 million worth of arms. Ambassador Dubs continued to warn the U.S. government of an impending Soviet takeover. But on February 14, 1979, he was kidnapped and held hostage in a Kabul hotel. It ended in tragedy. Against U.S. wishes, a rescue attempt was launched under Soviet guidance. Ambassador Dubs died in a hail of bullets.
We've come here to express our outrage at the senseless terrorism among those who pay inadequate value to human life.
2 days later, in a major foreign policy speech at Georgia Tech, he warned the Soviet Union.
If others interfere, directly or indirectly, they are on notice that this will have serious consequences and will affect our broader relationships with them.
But later in the same speech, President Carter made it clear that he didn't want the Soviet actions to damage his progress with the current U.S.-Soviet arms talks, SALT II.
Because this carefully negotiated and responsible arms control agreement will make the world safer and more secure, it is in our national interest to pursue it, even as we continue competition with the Soviet Union elsewhere in the world. Therefore, I will seek both to conclude this new SALT agreement and to respond to any Soviet behavior which adversely affects our interest.
On June 18, 1979, President Carter's desire for détente with the Soviet Union took a step forward when he and President Brezhnev signed the SALT II treaty. But in Afghanistan, tensions were growing. President Taraki was no longer in control. His radical Prime Minister, Mohammed Amin, was wielding more and more power. Kabul's prisons were full of political prisoners, and as many as 50 were executed every night. The camps along the Pakistan border seethed with hatred and desire for revenge. A pamphlet was published proclaiming that killing a communist was equal to praying 80,000 times to Allah. When the Afghanistan army began to suffer mass desertions, even the Soviets were alarmed at the results of Amin's leadership. In September 1979, President Taraki visited Moscow. Prominent on the agenda, how to curb the excesses of Prime Minister Amin's rule. Taraki met with President Leonid Brezhnev. It is believed that the Soviets conspired with Taraki to overthrow Amin.
Well, they got involved because they had supported a communist regime which began to break away from them, become a kind of Titoist regime, pursuing very doctrinaire, extremist communist tactics that were provoking lots of trouble in the country, a resistance, which meant that they were getting sucked into an untenable situation with a communist Tito in Afghanistan, and they wanted to replace him.
But Presidents Brezhnev and Taraki had not moved decisively enough. Amin heard of the plot, and when President Taraki returned to Afghanistan, he was arrested and strangled. Now Afghanistan was in the hands of a communist who was too radical and explosive for even the Soviet Union to handle. The murder of President Taraki had deeply upset the Soviets. Relations with the new president of Afghanistan, Mohammed Amin, were cold and hostile. More alarming to the Soviets, an Afghan guerrilla movement was gaining momentum. More and more tribesmen were joining force in rebellion against the communist government. At the same time, the Afghan army was rent with dissent. On October 14, 1979, the Afghan Air Force was forced to put down a major army rebellion. But it was probably events in Iran that disturbed the Soviet Union most of all. The rise of Ayatollah Khomeini and his fundamentalist Islamic movement shook the Soviet leadership. The Soviet Union had a large and potentially unstable Islamic population in their own Central Asian provinces. If Afghanistan's communist government was overthrown, it will almost certainly be by an anti-communist Islamic movement. The Soviet Union feared the spread of Islam. The Soviets continued building up their forces in Afghanistan. Soon, they had almost 2,000 advisors in the Afghanistan administration, and a further 3,500 in the military. Their increasing presence did not go unnoticed. In India, Afghan and Islamic demonstrators protested outside the Russian embassy. But in the Soviet Union, events were moving rapidly to a climax.
I've been told since by Soviet officials, and I have reason to believe it, that the issue of invading Afghanistan had come up to the Politburo at least 5 times, and those who were against the invasion had always prevailed. In the latter part of 1979, I think there was the feeling, what do we have to lose?
It was an extraordinary decision, and it was taken under extraordinary circumstances. And there were 2 reasons for that. If you remember when Pinochet came to power in Chile, there was a bloodbath there, and we had reason to believe that in Afghanistan it would be even worse. The second reason was that there was good reason to foresee the counter-revolutionary coup d'etat there. And in that case, it would be very logical for the Americans to move a military presence to Afghanistan. And that we couldn't live with.
By late November, the Soviets were flying in troops in large numbers. President Amin now feared for his life. He fled to King Amanullah's palace with 8 tanks and some loyal soldiers. On December 24th, the Soviets invaded. Soviet armor drove in on the same roads their government had built years before. And in Kabul, heavy transport planes landed 4,000 rapid deployment troops. The Afghans were stunned, and there was little resistance. In Washington, an alarmed National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, met with journalists.
We are, in effect, observing large-scale aggression.
How large?
Several tens of thousands of men. We don't know precisely how many yet. As of yesterday, our estimate was that between 20 to 25,000 Soviet forces are involved.
And you're saying
it is likely that the number is now larger.
At 7 p.m. on December 27, 1979, a KGB assassination squad and Soviet airborne commandos attacked the palace. By morning, the fighting was over, and President Amin was dead. The Soviets tried to disguise it as a domestic coup, but their responsibility was difficult to conceal.
The initial announcements of the December 27th coup were clearly pre-recorded broadcasts. And there are reliable indications that they were broadcast from transmitters inside the Soviet Union, purporting to be Radio Afghanistan.
Within days, the Soviets had installed Babrak Karmal as the new president. A staunch, pro-Soviet communist, he had flown back from exile in the Soviet Union to take over Afghanistan. It was a triumphant return. But behind the smiles and apparent jubilation was a world of uncertainty. For Karmal, doubts about how to gain control of his rebellious country. For the Soviets, fears about how America would react to this blatant act of communist aggression. So as the new year dawned in Kabul, the world was left wondering, was this the beginning of a dangerous new conflict between the eagle and the bear?